How do we know what we think we know? Most of your reality was handed to you by someone with an interest. Before you could read, before you could question, before you even knew there were other versions. They called it education, they called it science, they called it history, they called it common sense. And here you are, largely living inside it still. This video is about what happens when you start pulling on that thread. Nothing here will be isolated. Every idea will be a door. We will move through neuroscience, psychology, sociology, political philosophy, propaganda theory, philosophy of science, and finally, the borderline where official knowledge meets fringe narratives. We will return to many of these ideas in later videos on alternative history, contested science, reset theories, and other fringe material. Prologue. How reality gets installed. So how do we know what we think we know about the world? Who has ever personally seen an atom or a strand of DNA? Who has ever personally replicated the experiments that established their existence? Who has ever personally inspected an airplane before boarding it? Who has ever personally audited a bank, a central bank, a military facility, a national security agency, a government administration, an international corporation? Who has ever personally verified what happens inside a space station, a space agency, or a classified scientific archive? Who has ever personally audited a major archaeological site, a cultural heritage monument, or the private storage rooms of a major museum? Who has ever personally witnessed or truly verified the epicenter of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, anything from what we were taught at school about history, chemistry, biology, physics? Who is a specialist in everything? And yet, we live as if we know the basic facts about all these things, or at least as if reliable information about them is easily available to us. But is it? Once we look closely, almost everything we call knowledge reaches us through mediation. We trust textbooks, experts, institutions, maps, scientific models, legal systems, medical advice, archives, databases, and the testimony of people we will never meet. Which raises a question we usually postpone. What if some of those intermediaries have interests of their own? We do not personally verify most of reality. We inherit it. We trust it. We live inside it. This is the basic condition of civilization. No individual can verify the whole world alone. So every human being carries a model of reality, a working picture of what is true, what is possible, what is dangerous, what is normal, and who should be trusted. Different areas of expertise approach this problem from different angles. Neuroscience suggests that the brain is not a passive receiver of reality. Instead of simply recording, it predicts, filters, interprets reality. Almost like a controlled hallucination, constantly corrected by incoming data. And here is how far the controlled hallucination metaphor actually goes. Experiments from several convergent disciplines point toward the same disturbing implication. In principle, A brain would not know the difference if it were sitting in a laboratory flask filled with nutrient solution instead of inside a skull, provided it were fed precisely calibrated electrical signals to the sensory processing areas that normally receive signals from the body's sensory organs. It would still build a reality picture, not because the flask is real life, but because the brain doesn't experience reality directly. It experiences processed signals. Moreover, strictly speaking, there is no simple way for an individual to prove that they are not such a brain in a flask, opening the window to all kinds of fringe interpretations, from the simulation hypothesis to philosophical solipsism. The brain compares new information with what it already expects to find, and when something violates those expectations, it does not automatically surrender the model. First, it tries to discount, reframe, or ignore the contradiction. Because maintaining a stable model is metabolically cheaper than revising it. It saves energy. To revise deep expectations, the brain usually needs contradictions strong enough, persistent enough, or meaningful enough to force an update, what we might call a cognitive shock. In the same time, ignoring contradictions burns a lot of cognitive fuel. In order for the brain to fork, the metabolic cost of ignoring the contradicting signal should exceed the cost of changing the model. The likelihood of that update depends partly on cognitive flexibility, the brain's capacity to tolerate uncertainty without triggering a threat response. In other words, the brain is not optimized for abstract truth. It is optimized for a reality model that works well enough to keep the organism alive. Psychology adds another layer. Our attention is limited. Our memory is selected. We notice some details and ignore others. We tend to accept evidence that fits what we already believe, and resist evidence that threatens the structure of our identity. Our worldview is not just a list of opinions. It is a filter. It decides which facts feel obvious, which facts feel suspicious, and which facts we do not notice at all. If neuroscience shows that the brain prefers stable models because they save energy, psychology shows why the mind defends established models once they become tied to identity. The mind is not simply hostile to novelty. It is hostile to destabilizing novelty. When new information threatens who we are, what we belong to, or what kind of world we think we live in. So the psyche develops a whole arsenal of cognitive distortions and defensive mechanisms. Confirmation bias, seeking, noticing, or remembering evidence that confirms what we already believe. Disconfirmation bias, applying far more scrutiny to evidence that threatens the existing model than to evidence that supports it. Motivated reasoning, working backward from the desired conclusion toward a justification. Cognitive dissonance reduction, reinterpreting uncomfortable information so it can fit inside the existing structure. Source delegitimization, attacking the messenger instead of engaging with the message. In this way, a worldview can absorb contradictory information and convert it into further confirmation. This is why changing someone's worldview is rarely just a matter of showing them the facts. Facts do not enter an empty room. They enter a defended structure. Then comes the sociological layer. We do not build our worldview alone. Long before we are capable of critically assessing reality, reality has already been explained to us by parents, schools, media, religion, science, class, culture, language. All of them give us categories before we know how to question categories. They teach us what counts as normal, what counts as respectable, what counts as nonsense, what kind of information or sources should be trusted, and what kind of information or sources should be dismissed. Sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann argued that society creates meanings, turns them into institutions, and then teaches the next generation to experience those meanings as reality itself. In other words, every generation inherits a world built on previous generations. And by the time we become old enough to examine that world, which normally doesn't happen before our mid to late adolescence, much of our worldview is already installed. The categories are already familiar. The authorities are already named. The forbidden questions are already marked. The official version of reality has already begun to feel like common sense. This does not mean everything we inherit is false. It does not mean parents, teachers, scientists, or institutions are simply lying. But it does mean that what we call reality is never delivered to us raw. It teaches us through intermediaries: culture, authority, language, education, the social world into which we were born. So the question is not only, what do I believe? The deeper question is, who taught me what reality is supposed to look like before I was old enough to ask? This leads to the central theme of this essay. If human beings need models of reality to function, and if societies need shared models of reality to cooperate, then official narratives are not accidental. They are part of how civilizations hold themselves together. The question is not simply, are official narratives true or false? The deeper question is, why does every society need some version of an official reality in the first place? Chapter 1. Civilization runs on trust. Modern life is absurdly dependent on shared trust. We board an airplane without personally checking the engine. We eat food prepared by strangers. We drive through intersections because we trust that other people will obey the traffic lights. We trust that digits in a bank server represent money we can spend, not just entries in a database. We take medicine because we rely on systems of testing, regulation, and expertise. We use maps because we trust the territory has been accurately represented. We live inside a vast network of invisible assumptions, and most of the time we do not notice them. We only notice trust when it breaks, when the bank collapses, when the court turns out to be corrupt, when experts contradict themselves, when the media is caught lying, when we suddenly notice that history has been changing behind our backs, when the currency inflates, when the institutions that were supposed to stabilize reality become sources of uncertainty themselves. Trust is not a sentimental luxury. It is infrastructure. A civilization without trust does not merely become unpleasant. It becomes personally expensive. Every contract requires personal enforcement. Every transaction requires personal suspicion. Every stranger becomes a possible direct threat. Every dispute becomes something you may have to resolve yourself. Every institution becomes a potential fraud. Eventually, society begins to lose the ability to coordinate at scale. This is where political philosophy enters the story, because one of the oldest questions in political thought goes back to the problem of human nature. Are people good enough to regulate themselves, or dangerous enough to require authority? And what happens when no shared authority exists? Chapter 2. Why institutions exist. In the history of political thought, Thomas Hobbes stands as one of the central figures, but he is often reduced to a crude slogan: humans are selfish, therefore we need a strong state. If we look deeper, Hobbes was asking something more precise. What happens when there is no accepted authority capable of resolving disputes? Imagine a society with no trusted court, no enforceable contract, no accepted law, no recognized mediator. People may cooperate. Families may help each other. Neighbors may form alliances. Communities may build systems of mutual support, but eventually conflict appears. Property, debt, inheritance, violence, accusation, revenge. Who decides what really happened? Who decides what owns what? Who decides whether punishment is justice or merely retaliation? Without an accepted arbitrator, every person becomes judge in their own case. And when everyone is judge in their own case, there are no shared facts, only competing claims backed by competing loyalties. Evidence becomes subordinate to allegiance. Justice becomes indistinguishable from power. This is why institutions emerge. Courts, governments, universities, scientific bodies. Not because human beings are always monsters, but because cooperation among millions of strangers requires mechanisms for stabilizing facts, resolving disputes, and enforcing expectations. Institutions are society's attempt to answer one question: what version of reality we all agree to act upon? The uncomfortable corollary: whoever controls the institutions controls the answer. This is why official narratives matter. They are not merely stories. They are coordination systems. A legal system needs an accepted version of what happened. A school system needs an accepted curriculum. A scientific community needs accepted methods. A state needs a shared history, not because everyone must think the same thoughts, but because without some shared assumptions about what is real, large-scale cooperation among strangers becomes impossible. Chapter 2.1 Plato and the Noble Lie. Long before Hobbes, Plato was already circling the same problem from a darker angle. In the Republic, Plato asks how a city remains unified, not merely how it can be ruled by force, but how different classes of people come to accept their place inside a shared order. His answer is uncomfortable. Plato suggests that a stable society may require a founding myth, a story that is not literally true, but is socially necessary. He calls it the noble lie. The logic is cold and precise. If people believe they belong to one common body, if they believe their social roles are natural, if they believe the hierarchy of the city reflects some deeper cosmic or moral order, then the city becomes easier to govern. Conflict decreases. Obedience becomes internal. The political order no longer looks constructed. It looks inevitable. This is one of the earliest philosophical confrontations with a question that never went away. Can a falsehood be justified if it preserves social order? Or, more brutally, can societies survive without myths people are not allowed to question? Plato's noble lie is not modern propaganda. It is more foundational than that. It asks whether political order itself depends on stories that must be believed before they can be critically examined. And this forces a choice about human nature. If human beings are naturally wise, cooperative, and self-regulating, then shared myths are unnecessary, manipulative even. But if human beings are unstable, tribal, and easily pulled into conflict, then shared myths may function as psychological infrastructure. They don't just explain the city, they hold it together, which means institutions may not preserve official narratives only because rulers are corrupt. They may preserve them because societies are genuinely fragile. But the danger is immediate. Once we accept that a lie can be justified for the good of the whole, who decides what the good of the whole actually means? The philosopher, the king, the priest, the expert, the algorithm. The problem returns at a higher level. Who arbitrates the arbitrator? The noble lie may begin as a tool of social unity. It has a tendency to end as a technology of domination. Here we have two ancient problems that have never been fully solved. Hobbes asks, how does society avoid violent fragmentation without a shared authority? Plato asks, does social order require myths that cannot survive full scrutiny? Underneath both questions is a third, one neither of them fully answered. Is cooperation something authority imposes on human beings? Or is cooperation the very condition without which a group of people could never become a society, let alone a civilization? Chapter 3. The authorized version of reality. So did Hobbes and Plato answer their own questions? Hobbes did, clearly. His Leviathan does not rely on justice or morality to hold society together. It relies on math. The sovereign concentrates enough legitimate violence that challenging it guarantees your destruction. Rebellion becomes too expensive, not because it's wrong, but because the numbers don't work. You cannot coordinate enough people to overcome a monopoly on force without the kind of trust that the state of nature systematically destroys. It's not ethics, it's mutually assured disadvantage. Which is why the same logic runs through nuclear deterrence, corporate monopoly strategy, and the neighborhood protection racket equally. The sovereign and the mob boss operate on structurally similar principles. The only difference Hobbes would acknowledge is scale. Plato answered too, but evasively. His answer is the philosopher king. Someone who knows the truth but governs through myth because the population cannot handle it. The noble lie is justified because only the enlightened few can see reality clearly enough to design the stories everyone else needs to believe. In other words, yes, society requires myths that cannot survive full scrutiny. And that's acceptable, as long as the right people control which myths. Both answers quietly smuggle in the same unresolved problem. Hobbes cannot explain what prevents the sovereign from becoming a predator rather than an arbitrator. Plato cannot explain how you identify genuine philosophical wisdom versus someone who merely claims it. Both solutions collapse back into the same question: who arbitrates the arbitrator? Neither of them answer that. Nobody since has either. But what came after was in some ways more disturbing than the original question. Because thinker after thinker across completely different disciplines, across centuries, arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion Plato had circled in Athens. Real societies are not built on truth. They are built on myths that function as truth. Sorrell said political movements require animating myths not meant to be literally true, but felt as absolute. Nietzsche understood that when a society's founding myth collapses, it doesn't find truth underneath. It generates a new myth compulsively, because it cannot function in the naked absence of one. Pareto argued that the official justifications for power are always post hoc rationalization, mythology dressed as reason. Gramsci showed that the ruling class doesn't mainly govern by force. It governs by making its worldview feel like common sense, invisible as water to a fish. And then Bernays, Freud's nephew, took it out of philosophy entirely and turned it into engineering. He designed modern public relations as a deliberate technology for manufacturing consent through methodological framing. He wrote a book called Propaganda in 1928 and was completely unapologetic about it. By the 20th century, the noble lie was no longer a philosophical thought experiment. It was an industry. Bourdieu called the endpoint the spectacle, a society that had replaced reality with its image so thoroughly that most inhabitants could no longer tell the difference, and were no longer particularly troubled by that. So the question Plato raised in Athens never disappeared. It just got answered, quietly, practically, institutionally, in a way he might have recognized. Yes, Society requires myths that cannot survive full scrutiny. The only thing that changed is that we industrialized the production of them. But wait, if official narratives are coordination myths rather than verified truths, if institutions exist to stabilize a shared reality rather than to discover it, then we have a problem we cannot easily dismiss. Have we just academically legitimized the possibility that some ideas dismissed as conspiracy may later become established science? Not equally, not uncritically, but structurally. Because if the distinction between legitimate knowledge and fringe theory is partially political, if it is about who holds institutional authority to declare what counts as real, then dismissing an idea because it is unauthorized is not a rational move. It is a political one dressed as rational one. This doesn't mean all fringe theories are correct. Bad reasoning is still bad reasoning. False evidence is still false evidence. The quality of argument and evidence still matters enormously. But it means something important has shifted. The question is no longer simply, is this idea mainstream or fringe? The real question becomes, what is the quality of the reasoning and evidence, independent of who authorized it? That is a much harder question, and a much more honest one. Thomas Kuhn documented exactly this in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Paradigm shifts don't happen simply because a new theory is proven true and the old one proven false. They happen because anomalies accumulate, institutional power shifts, and the old guard eventually dies. Truth and institutional legitimacy travel together, but they are not the same thing. They never were, which means that throughout history, the fringe theory of one century has a tendency to become the established science of the next. Heliocentrism was fringe. Germ theory was fringe. Continental drift was fringe. The Big Bang was fringe. Every single one was dismissed by the institutional consensus of its time. Every single one was eventually absorbed, not because institutions became honest, but because the evidence became too expensive to keep discounting. Where does that leave us? With a genuinely uncomfortable architecture. Institutions are necessary because without shared reality coordination, large-scale cooperation collapses. But institutions are also self-interested because any system granted authority over what counts as real will inevitably use that authority to protect itself. Which means the relationship between official knowledge and fringe knowledge is not merely a relationship between truth and error. It is also a power struggle over who gets to define reality. And that struggle, quiet, continuous, and largely invisible, is precisely what appears to be breaking open right now. Chapter 4. Cooperation is not accidental. Part 1. The shadow of the future. Cooperation can look moral, but it is also strategic. This is where Robert Axelrod and the prisoner's dilemma become useful. In a one-time interaction, betrayal may seem profitable. If I cheat you and never see you again, I may gain. But if we must meet again tomorrow, the calculation changes. Repeated interaction creates what Axelrod called the shadow of the future. The future reaches backward into the present. It disciplines behavior. People cooperate today because they expect consequences tomorrow. Reputation matters. Memory matters. Punishment matters. The expectation of the future interaction turns trust into a rational strategy. This is not only true for individuals. Markets require predictable rules. Science requires repeatable methods. Law requires precedent. Politics requires legitimacy. Even ordinary daily life requires confidence that tomorrow will resemble today enough for planning to make sense. Institutions preserve this predictability. They extend the shadow of the future beyond personal relationships. You do not need to personally know the banker, the pilot, the judge, the doctor, or the engineer. You trust the system that certifies them. That is the architecture of institutional civilization. It allows strangers to cooperate as if they belonged to a shared world. Part 2. The Lost Horizon. But there is another side to the shadow of the future. People cooperate not only because they fear punishment tomorrow. They cooperate because they believe tomorrow exists as a meaningful extension of today, that their sacrifices will lead somewhere, that their work will build something, that their children will inherit a world moving forward, not merely a more expensive version of the present. And this is where modern civilization begins to feel strange. For much of the 20th century, the future had a shape. Science fiction imagined flying cars, cities in the sky, concrete aging, cheap energy, space travel as something more than a symbolic elite spectacle. People may disagree about whether those dreams were realistic, but civilization projected a visible horizon, a promised destination. That horizon has quietly broken. It would be inaccurate to say nothing happened in the technological sense. We got computers, smartphones, the internet, artificial intelligence, or at least something resembling it. mRNA vaccines, gene editing, and surgeries that would have been death sentences a generation ago. But the change concentrated in the digital layer: screens, platforms, surveillance, finance, entertainment. While the physical future promised by mid-century imagination remained strangely delayed. The flying car became an app. The space age became a live stream. The conquered body became a subscription device. The future itself became a management interface. And when the future stops feeling like a destination, cooperation begins to erode. Why sacrifice today if tomorrow is only decay with better branding? Why trust institutions if they no longer deliver the world they promised? Why accept the official narrative when daily life feels more controlled, more expensive, more mediated, and less alive? The shadow of the future darkens, and when that happens, societies become vulnerable to alternative narratives. People begin looking forward to lost civilizations, suppressed technologies, golden ages, cycles, resets, not always because those theories are true, but because the official future no longer feels convincing. All of this raises the next question. Are institutions the only way to create cooperation? Chapter 5. Are institutions inevitable? Not everyone agrees that order must come from above. Russian anarchist philosopher Peter Kropotkin argued that mutual aid is as powerful a force in nature and human society as competition. Mikhail Bakunin said the state doesn't create social order, it colonizes social order that already exists. Emma Goldman demonstrated that cooperation without coercion was not utopian fantasy but lived practice. David Graeber spent his career as an anthropologist documenting the vast range of human societies that organized themselves without states, markets, or hierarchical institutions, and found cooperation, not chaos. And perhaps, most importantly for skeptics, Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics for empirically proving that communities can self-manage shared resources without either state control or market mechanisms, without tragedy, without collapse. Human beings do not only compete, they cooperate, they form communities. They help relatives, neighbors, friends, and sometimes strangers. They build informal networks of obligation long before the state arrives, and often long after it fails. History allegedly offers many examples of self-organization. Allegedly, because the official version of history has rarely been written by anarchists. Villages regulate land use. Merchants develop customs. Religious communities care for members. Families transmit norms. Online communities create rules. People cooperate voluntarily, without coercion from a central authority, more often than the standard political narrative admits. This matters because it collapses a false binary. The choice is not total chaos or total control. This is a genuine debate, one of the oldest in political thought, about how much order can emerge from below, how much authority must be imposed from above, and where healthy coordination ends and domination begins. Anarchists, libertarians, conservatives, liberals, sociologists, and economists all answer differently. But the question itself is unavoidable. If human beings can self-organize, then not every institution is automatically justified. If self-organization fails at scale, then institutions become difficult to avoid. This is the tension at the heart of civilization. People create institutions to solve problems. Then those institutions create new problems of their own. Chapter 6. The Institution Paradox. Institutions solve problems, but institutions also accumulate power. This is the paradox. We create courts to resolve disputes, then need to ask whether the courts are corrupt. We create governments to enforce order, then need to ask who controls the government. We create universities to protect knowledge, then need to ask whether universities protect the truth or merely reproduce consensus. We create media to inform the public, then need to ask who frames the information. We create digital platforms to connect people, then become dependent on systems that control visibility, access, commerce, dating, communication, and social life itself. Every intermediary begins as a solution. Over time, the intermediary becomes a gatekeeper. Who regulates the regulators? Who audits the auditors? Who arbitrates the arbitrator? This is not a minor technical issue. It is one of the deepest unsolved problems in social organization. Every bureaucracy tends to preserve itself. Every platform tends to optimize for its own survival. Every institution develops incentives that quietly diverge from its original mission. This is what Cory Doctorow called institutification, a term he coined for digital platforms. But the pattern appears everywhere. Services begin by serving users, then serve business clients, then serve investors, until the original users find themselves trapped inside systems that no longer primarily exist for them. The same pattern appears in politics, education, science, media, finance, and culture equally. A society creates institutions to stabilize reality. Then those institutions become powerful enough to define it. And here the institution paradox opens into something stranger still. Hierarchy doesn't only shape what we believe about history or science. It shapes what we can know about the most ordinary material facts of daily life. Consider, no individual, regardless of education, intelligence, or resources, can personally trace the complete production chain of any object they use. Not food, not medicine, not a microchip, not a barren ball. You can visit a factory, if they let you in, and if they do, you will see a section, a carefully managed fragment of a process whose other stages occur elsewhere under different ownership, in different jurisdictions, behind different legal protections. Patent law protects the rest. Commercial confidentiality protects the rest. Geographic distribution protects the rest. The result is that every object in your daily environment arrives through a chain of production that no single human being on Earth can fully verify, from raw material to finished product. This is not a conspiracy. It is the structural outcome of specialization, scaling, and intellectual property law. But it means something worth sitting with. The commoner, to use the blunt term, does not merely lack political power or historical knowledge. They lack the practical ability to verify the material basis of their own existence. And this has become fertile ground for some of the most radical fringe theories of recent years. That nothing around us is actually produced the way we are told it is. That the supply chains are theater. That the ingredients are not what the label says. These theories are almost certainly wrong in their specifics, but they are not irrational in their structure. They are the logical endpoint of a population that has been systematically excluded from visibility into the systems that sustain it, and has begun, in the absence of verifiable information, to fill the gap with imagination, which is what human beings have always done. When the official account cannot be verified and the fringe account cannot be falsified, the choice between them is no longer purely epistemological. It is psychological, it is social, it is, in the end, political, which raises a question that presses on a fault line even Hobbes or Plato could only glimpse. What happens when the institutions that define reality lose the trust of the people whose reality they are defining? Chapter 7. Power needs an audience. Now this brings us to another reason institutions preserve narratives. Not only order, status. Power is rational. A king is not a king in an empty room. A billionaire is not socially meaningful in a world where everyone has the same access, the same comfort, the same autonomy, and the same symbolic rank. Thorstein Veblen called this conspicuous consumption. The performance of superiority requires an audience capable of recognizing it. Pierre Bourdieu called it symbolic capital. Prestige, credentials, and cultural authority that only exist because a wider social field agrees to honor them. An elite is only an elite because there is a wider society beneath, around and outside it that recognizes the difference. Dominance needs observers. Privilege needs contrast. Hierarchy needs legitimacy. This is why ruling groups rarely want society to disappear completely. They need workers, consumers, specialists, administrators, soldiers, audiences, voters, believers, clients, and witnesses. They need the social field in which superiority can be displayed, measured, defended, and reproduced. This creates a second incentive behind official narratives. The first incentive is stability. A society needs shared reality because cooperation depends on it. The second incentive is hierarchy. Those who benefit from the existing order have reasons to protect the stories that make that order appear natural, deserved, inevitable, or too dangerous to question. And here is the important distinction. A ruling class does not need to concisely invent every belief from above. It is enough that schools, media, career systems, expert institutions, and cultural prestige repeatedly reward some interpretations of reality and punish others. Over time, the hierarchy starts to look like common sense. The winners appear competent, the losers appear irresponsible. The institutions appear neutral. The present order appears to be the natural outcome of events rather than result of conflict, selection, exclusion, inheritance, and power. This is not a secret conspiracy. It is something more pervasive and more difficult to see. It is an environment, and this is precisely why mass media was adopted so enthusiastically by every 20th century authoritarian regime, not merely as propaganda, but as a mechanism for producing the audience that power requires. Goebbels understood this, so did Bernays. The infrastructure of attention is the infrastructure of hierarchy. At this point, a reasonable person might ask the obvious question: if powerful groups, governments, intelligence agencies, old money, institutional networks do shape the information environment to protect their position, what exactly do they gain from it? Why bother managing what ordinary people believe about history, science, or how the world works? The answer most frequently given is straightforward. A population that cannot accurately map its own reality is easier to keep in place. Not through constant force. Force is expensive and unstable, but through management of what feels possible, normal, and inevitable. If you control the horizon, you control the direction of travel. But then comes the second question, and it's sharper. If the goal is to keep commoners as commoners, why not simply eliminate them? Wouldn't that be cleaner than the elaborate machinery of narrative management? The answer returns us to exactly where Veblen and Bourdieu left us. Because hierarchy requires an audience. Power is not a thing you possess in isolation. It is a relationship. It requires subordinates to be real. It requires workers to produce, consumers to spend, soldiers to fight, audiences to admire, and believers to legitimate. A ruling class with no one to rule is not powerful. It is simply a small group of people alone in a room. This is why the goal was never elimination. It was calibration. Not too much autonomy, that produces independence. Not too little, that produces revolt. Just enough dependency, just enough hope, just enough complexity to keep the majority functional, compliant, and convinced that the existing arrangement is either natural, inevitable, or the best available option. The noble lie, in other words, is not a luxury of power. It is the operating system. This does not mean every official narrative is false, but it does mean official narratives are never socially innocent. They do not merely describe reality. They distribute legitimacy. They tell people who deserves authority, who deserves suspicion, who deserves admiration, and who should remain silent. So when someone questions an official narrative, they may not only be questioning a fact, they may be threatening a hierarchy. Chapter 8. Why official narratives exist. Now we can see why official narratives are so powerful. They do two things at once. They stabilize cooperation and they legitimize hierarchy. Imagine a government publicly declares, "Our courts are unreliable. Our scientific institutions cannot be trusted. Our currency may collapse. Our history is uncertain or unknown. Our experts may be wrong. Our archives may be incomplete. our founding myths may be deceptive. Even if some of these statements contained elements of truth, would society become more stable or less? This is their uncomfortable point. Stable societies have an incentive to preserve stable narratives, not because there is always a secret conspiracy, not because everyone is consciously lying, but because public uncertainty is operationally dangerous. If trust collapses, cooperation collapses. If cooperation collapses, institutions lose legitimacy. If institutions lose legitimacy, power becomes naked. And when power becomes naked, what Gramsci called the collapse of hegemony into mere domination, hierarchy has to defend itself by force rather than consent. That is the nightmare every stable order tries to avoid. Jaques Ellul, whose 1962 study of propaganda remains one of the most precise analyses ever written, argued that modern propaganda is not primarily about lying. It is about managing the social environment so that certain questions never arise. Not censorship, not fabrication, simply the careful cultivation of what feels worth asking. So official narratives perform a double function. They reduce uncertainty for ordinary people, and they protect the legitimacy of those who govern, administer, interpret, certify, and benefit from the system. A narrative can be true and still serve power. A narrative can be simplified and still preserve order. A narrative can be deceptive and still remain institutionally useful. And here is something worth sitting with. The CIA's MK Ultra program, Systematic Psychological Experimentation on Unwitting Civilians, was an official secret for 20 years before congressional hearings forced acknowledgement. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments ran for 40 years under federal supervision, during which hundreds of men were left untreated for a disease that was killing them, so that researchers could observe its natural progression. Every one of these was an official narrative that held, then cracked, then was absorbed as an exception rather than a pattern. The conspiracy theorist of 1960 became the congressional hearing of 1965. This is not a minor historical footnote. It is the evidentiary basis for taking seriously a question that comfortable institutions prefer not to answer. What kinds of truth can a society afford to destabilize? What kinds of uncertainty can institutions survive? And what kinds of historical knowledge would threaten not only public order, but the symbolic legitimacy of those standing at the top? Chapter 9. Pattern recognition and conspiracy thinking. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. This is not a defect. This is one of the reasons we survived. We notice tracks, we infer danger, we connect causes and consequences. We recognize faces, intentions, cycles, threats, and opportunities. Science itself begins with pattern recognition. Someone notices that diseases spread in pattern. that planets move in pattern, that fossils appear in layers, that civilizations rise and fall. But pattern recognition has a shadow. Sometimes we see structure where there is only coincidence. Sometimes we connect dots that do not belong together. Sometimes suspicion becomes identity. Sometimes doubt becomes addiction. And sometimes, and this is the part that makes the problem genuinely difficult, the person who sees a real pattern too early is dismissed as irrational or conspiratorial, precisely because the pattern has not yet been officially recognized. This is why the border between skepticism and paranoia is not as clean as society pretends. Healthy skepticism asks for evidence. Pathological skepticism rejects every possible evidence in advance. Healthy trust allows cooperation. Blind trust makes manipulation easy. Healthy pattern recognition discovers hidden structure. Compulsive pattern seeking turns the world into a maze of intentional signs. Karl Popper identified the structural problem with conspiracy thinking. It is unfalsifiable by design. Every piece of counter-evidence becomes proof of how deep the conspiracy goes. The theory cannot be wrong, which means, in the strictest epistemological sense, it cannot be right either. But Popper's unfalsifiability cuts both ways. An unfalsifiable official narrative is epistemologically identical to an unfalsifiable conspiracy theory. This is not an accusation, it is a logical observation about the limits of institutionally produced knowledge, and one that institutions have very little incentive to advertise. Michael Shermer demonstrated that both believers and skeptics engage in motivated reasoning, aimed in opposite directions, using identical mechanisms. Umberto Eco observed that conspiracy thinking is not merely an intellectual error. It is a social structure, one that historically expands wherever institutions lose legitimacy and people need to explain their situation without access to reliable information. Conspiracy thinking expands precisely where institutional honesty contracts, which means the most effective response to conspiratorial thinking is not ridicule. It is trustworthy institutions. And this is exactly why people who question dominant narratives are often stigmatized. Sometimes they are wrong. Sometimes they are reckless. Sometimes they are projecting personal distrust onto the entire world. But sometimes they are asking questions that institutions have strong incentives not to welcome. Because every official reality has boundaries. And the people who test those boundaries are rarely treated neutrally. Chapter 10. Science, Paradigms, and the Right to Question Models. This matters especially when we talk about science, because science is often presented to the public as if it were a finished map of reality. It is not. Science is a method, a community, a set of institutions, a history of models, and a process of correction. Some models become dominant because they explain evidence better than their rivals. Some because they make successful predictions. Some because they are technologically useful. But scientific paradigms are also taught, funded, defended, simplified, popularized, and institutionalized. By the time an ordinary person encounters them, they often arrive not as open questions, but as settled reality. Gravity, electricity, space, matter, time, these are the uncontested ones. Models so thoroughly confirmed by prediction and technology that questioning them requires extraordinary evidence. But then there are others: human origins, the age of civilization, the structure of consciousness, the history of catastrophe, the timeline of the ancient world. These arrive through the same institutional channels: education, media, expert consensus, but rest on considerably more contested empirical ground. This difference between the two categories is rarely explained to the public. Most people do not personally verify any of these things. They inherit them through education, media, expert systems, and institutional trust. This does not mean those models are false. It does not mean experts are lying. It does not mean every rejected alternative is secretly true. But it does mean that even scientific reality reaches most people through authority structures. And once a model becomes foundational to education, industry, technology, state power, and public legitimacy, questioning it is no longer treated as a purely intellectual act. It becomes socially dangerous. Imre Lakatos showed why. Scientific research programs have a protected core of foundational assumptions surrounded by a belt of auxiliary hypotheses. When anomalies appear, scientists modify the belt, not the core. The core is protected not by evidence alone, but by institutional investment, career structures, funding dependencies, and the weight of everything built on top of it. Paul Feyerabend went further. In Against Method, he argued that science has no single method, and that historically the breakthroughs that advanced human knowledge most dramatically were achieved by people who violated the methodological rules of their time, not by following consensus, by defying it. History confirms this repeatedly. Ignaz Semmelweis proved that hand-washing prevented deaths in maternity wards. The medical establishment rejected him, institutionally destroyed him, and he died in an asylum. Barry Marshall, unable to get institutional funding for human trials, drank a solution of H. pylori bacteria to prove stomach ulcers were bacterial rather than stress-related. He was ridiculed. He won the Nobel Prize. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift and was treated as a crank for 30 years before the evidence became impossible to ignore. These are not fringe cases. They are standard entries in the mainstream history of science, which means institutional resistance to paradigm change is not paranoid fantasy. It is a repeatable, documented, historically verified pattern. The real issue is therefore not whether blindly trust mainstream paradigms or blindly reject them. Both positions are intellectually lazy. The serious questions are different. How do models of reality become dominant? What evidence supports them? What anomalies do they struggle with? What alternative explanations were dismissed and why? Where does legitimate expertise end and institutional self-protection begin? And how do we question a paradigm without falling into fantasy? That is the position of this channel. Not belief, not debunking, not rebellion for its own sake. Disciplined suspicion toward every model of reality. Mainstream, alternative, scientific, political, religious, or mythological. So before we approach any fringe theories, reset theories, forgotten civilizations, alternative history, suppressed science, we needed this foundation, and now we have it. Human beings do not access reality directly. We build models of it. Our brains predict, our memories select, our attention filters, our families and schools transmit assumptions before we can examine them, as we saw at the very beginning of this video. Our institutions stabilize shared reality. Our societies preserve narratives, because without shared narratives, trust begins to collapse, and without trust, civilization becomes almost impossible. This does not yet prove that any particular reset theory is true. This does not yet prove that history has been hidden. This does not yet prove that elites are secretly coordinating every version of reality. Yet. But it does establish something more basic, and in some ways more unsettling. If a society depends on a shared model of the past, then challenges to that model will never be treated as purely academic. They will feel dangerous, because the past is not just information. The past legitimizes the present. It explains who we are, where we came from, which institutions deserve authority, and what kind of future we should expect. And there is a phenomenon, not fringe, not conspiratorial, but academically documented and historically verified, that belongs at the center of everything that follows. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, the deliberate, systematic erasure of a person, an event, or an entire period from the official record. Practiced in Rome, practiced in Egypt, practiced in the Soviet Union, where photographs were retouched and encyclopedias were recalled and reissued with pages removed. Practiced in China, practiced wherever a new order needed the past to look different from what it was. The question is not whether civilizations erase their own history. They demonstrably do. The question is, how much did they erase, and what is still missing?